gracias por estar hoy con nosotros. Quiero decir que es para nosotros un honor poder tener hoy y durante un mes en nuestro programa al famoso psiquiatra suizo Carl Gustav Jung. Un hombre cuyo genio y humanidad hizo que su voz llegara mucho más lejos que el reino de la psiquiatría, redefiniendo la naturaleza esencial del ser humano. Desde sus investigaciones sobre los misterios del inconsciente hasta su visión más expansiva de la psiquis humana, fue y es una de las grandes figuras del siglo XX. Hoy vamos a presentar la primera parte de un documental biográfico tomado de más de 40 horas de filmación del Instituto de Jung en Los Ángeles. Cuenta con valiosa documentación y extraordinarias entrevistas de sus colegas, pacientes y amigos, brindándonos así una imagen más global de este genio de nuestro siglo. Muchas gracias y los dejamos con el programa.
I met him when I was 18, and I began in the year later, in 34, I began analysis with him. We went out there to the tower, and out of the bushes, suddenly we were standing around kind of, you know, awkwardly, as one does, not knowing what was going to happen. And then out of the bushes came a man, and I was deeply impressed by him. I thought naturally he was a Methuselah, because when you are 18, you think a 58-year-old is ready for the cemetery. He's a story which you can read in the memories about this girl who was on the moon and had to fight a demon, and the black demon got her. And he pretended, he told it in a way as if she really had been on the moon and it had happened. And I was very rationalistically trained from school, so I said indignantly, but she imagined to be on the moon, or she dreamt it, but she wasn't on the moon. And he looked at me earnestly and said, yes, she was on the moon. I still remember looking over the lake there and thinking, and either this man is crazy or I am too stupid to understand what he means. And then suddenly it dawned on me, he means that what happens psychically is the real reality. And this other moon, this stony desert which goes around the earth, that's illusion, or that's only pseudo-reality. And that hit me tremendously deeply. When I crawled rather drunk into bed because he gave us a lot of burgundy, that evening I thought it will take you 10 years to digest what you experience today.
Both Jung and I minded most of all about wholeness, about coming whole, and that I've got at it through my art by always trying to draw or paint things that looked whole, animals, primitives, anything that seemed still at one with itself and whole. And he got at it by studying the things that were wrong with people, and then realizing the way to get it right was to find their wholeness, to find the opposite, the thing that was destroying it, said Heaven. And of course I went through tremendous encounter with the unconscious. One always does in analysis, particularly with him. He didn't let you pick flowers by the way.
When you met him in the club or when you met him privately or in analysis, it was always a man interested in the, I would like to use the word, in the supernatural food. Always. Yeah. Into the depths. And you see, you could come into his room in analysis. And he was just speaking about the dreams you had before, last night. Not knowing them, but he was involved. He was so transparent for people. And that was a fascinating thing in the relationship with Jung. Therefore, everybody who knew Jung has a feeling he speaks one's own language.
We started talking, and I went home with him afterwards. And to Mrs. Jung's despair, we sat talking until about 3 o'clock in the morning without break. And again, it was I had this very strange feeling, although it was snowing outside, bitterly cold, that I was sitting round one of the first fires in a camp somewhere in the bush in Africa, talking, as you can only talk in those conditions. And I said to him, why don't you come back to Africa with me? He said, you know, when I came back from Mount Elgon and from Kenya and living amongst the witch doctors of Africa, he said, I found so much witchcraft in Switzerland. I felt that I had to deal with all this witchcraft first before I could, before I can travel again. And he used to refer to himself as an old witch doctor. Very often when people asked him, are you a Protestant? Are you a Catholic? He said, don't ask me these questions. He said, you know, I'm only an old African who finds his God in his dreams. And he really meant that. He really meant that. We had this tremendous human, almost animal warmth and immediacy. It was the immediacy of the laugh that got one.
Said that humor was the only divine quality of man. And that Basel helped him with a lot. Basel, the Baselers have an extraordinary sense of humor. And their carnival is really marvelous.
Jung took you there once to the
Yes,
Basel.
he did. A lot of us, we went there the night before and got up at 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, I think, to see the so-called Morgenstreich. And the procession comes through with lights. It's most impressive.
This feeling that he had, that if man lived his life religiously, if he lived his life symbolically, then it was almost as if what the theologians called God, and my Zulus called Nkulu, the first spirit, where the first spirit had passed over some of his power and some of his responsibilities to the human being, and that the human being had a God-like task to perform in creation, and the extent to which he performed it, he derived his meaning. It's a very important part of Jung's thinking.
Oh, well, I just paid a visit to him in Vienna, and then we talked for 13 hours without interruption.
13 hours
For 13 hours without interruption. We didn't realize that we were almost dead at the end of it, but it was tremendously interesting. He was the old man and had a great experience, and he was, of course, way ahead of me, and so I settled down to learn something first.
I had written that book that cost me my friendship with Freud because he couldn't accept it. Yes. To him, the unconscious was a product of consciousness. Yes. And it simply contained the remnants. It was sort of storeroom where all the discarded things of consciousness were were heaped up and left. But to me, the unconscious then was already a matrix, a sort of basis of consciousness of a creative nature, namely capable of autonomous acts, autonomous intrusions into consciousness.
Man's soul is a complicated thing, and it takes sometimes half a lifetime to get somewhere in one's psychological development. You know, it is by no means always matter of psychotherapy or treatment of neuroses. It is all psychology has also the aspect of a pedagogical method in the widest sense of the word. It is something.
Education.
It is an education. It is something like antique philosophy, and not what we understand by a technique. It is something that touches upon the whole of man, and which challenges also the whole of man in the patient or whatever the receiving part is, as well as in the doctor.
One of the tremendous things which Jung did was to always emphasize the aspect of man's totality. And our totality is not complete unless we take our human failings into it. It doesn't mean that I necessarily have always to live my human failings. I obviously may have to take responsibility for them. But they are not only part of me, but they are part of every human being. That is to say, it is part of man.
Consciousness is one factor, and there is another factor, equally important, that is the unconscious, that can interfere with consciousness any time it pleases. And of course, I say to myself now, this is very uncomfortable, because I think I am the only master in my house, but I must admit that there is another somebody in that house that can play tricks. And I had to deal with the unfortunate victims of that interference every day in my patients.
Analysis, proper analysis, particularly Jungian analysis, begins and ends with conscience. That is, that you take responsibility, that you take into consideration all those manifestations which so far have remained in the unconscious. In other words, you are not conscious of. And if you start taking the responsibility for those manifestations, like shadow qualities and whatnot, then this is a very strong test for your conscience, isn't it? And so, I mean, you have to only have to think of the beginning of psychoanalysis. I mean, it took an enormous amount of moral courage to face these facts, which so far have not been considered or repressed.
I felt that Jung should tell me what I should do, whether I should write a book, whether I should get a divorce, what I should do. And he wouldn't. And so I got mad at him. And I said, why is everybody so mean to me? And he said, why are you so mean to everybody? So I stormed out. And